Morning, everybody. I'm super excited to welcome Matt Green, co-founder of Sales Assembly. Matt, welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
I've been following you on LinkedIn and I've read a lot of your posts, and we were chatting a bit right before the recording. And you have a very unique background. So before we get going, it would be great if you'd please take a minute or two, introduce yourself, introduce your company to our audience.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Matt Green. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a company called Sales Assembly. Sales Assembly is about 8 years old now. My partner Jeff and I launched this back in 2017. And essentially what we do is we provide all the day-to-day skills training for the go-to-market teams, both sales and post-sales, of B2B technology companies. And we're fortunate enough to work with a few hundred B2B tech companies today, different shapes and sizes, all selling different products to different people. Our thesis behind launching this was, when you think about all things training within go-to-market teams, you have product training, you have process training, then you have skills training, skills like discovery, storytelling, negotiation, conflict resolution. Those things tend to fall by the wayside from a training perspective within these organizations. So we chose bolt on to the side of a few hundred of these B2B tech companies to provide that critical skills-based training throughout the year.
That's amazing. Can you tell us a little bit about your background? Like, how did you end up, starting up this company?
Yeah, I admittedly have a really weird background. I've sort of Forrest Gumped my way through life, just, happenstance, bumping into different things. But yeah, after school, I started working in finance and wealth management, worked at big firms like JP Morgan for an extended period of time, smaller investment banks. I actually found myself working for a small investment bank that was raising money for early stage companies. And in my capacity there, met the founder of a seed stage company here in Chicago that I began engaging with as a client. And after they raised their A, and after I built a really great relationship with the founder and the founding team, they had asked me to come on board to lead sales there. So I did, left my career in finance to join this world of tech startups. First person who I ended up hiring in my new role there was my now business partner, Jeff. So we were both leading sales teams there for a few years, both found ourselves on the unfortunate end of a reduction in force back in 2016. And that was actually a big reason why we launched Sales Assembly, because we found ourselves without jobs one day. So it was a question of, okay, did we go get W-2 jobs or do we try doing something else? So we chose the latter.
When you look at sort of, the transition that you made from a career-wise, from investment to teaching, is there a common thread, or these are completely two different pivots?
Yeah, I think that it's a really interesting question. I think that there's more similarities than one person might think, at least looking at things on paper. But to be fair, my role within, my previous life, at the end of the day, was essentially a lot of sales, right? But what was I selling? I was selling myself, going out to wealthy people, to NBA players, and convincing them, well, no, here's why me and my firm, the firm that I'm affiliated with, here's why we're going to be the best people to manage your money compared to Morgan Stanley or Merrill Lynch or any other organization that they would have access to. So I think, the common thread that connects my entire career is I've always been in some type of sales or client-facing capacity. I didn't really have a salary until I was maybe, 35, 36 years old. So the first, 15, 16 years of my professional life was all, sort of eat what you kill, for the lack of a better term, at least from a compensation perspective.
That's amazing. So when you moved into sort of, leading a sales role and building a company oriented towards sales, how did you transition into software? Why did you not stay in financials, or is financial still your set of focus?
No, the thing about the financial services industry is, in order to operate in that industry, you have to get a whole lot of licenses and accreditations, which I did. But the interesting and sometimes frustrating thing about that industry is, if you're not affiliated with a firm, with a broker dealer for, I think it's 2 years, then your licenses expire. And if you want to go back into operating in that industry, you have to go through all the testing again, which would be a huge pain. So I actually remember vividly after moving over into this tech sales ecosystem, getting a letter from FINRA essentially saying like, hey, your licenses haven't been affiliated with an organization for the past 2 years. They're going to expire if you don't, come back into the industry and get a job now. And I do remember at that time making the conscious decision, no, I don't want to go back to the industry. I really like this environment, even though I was just impacted by a riff and found myself unemployed for a short period of time before launching Sales Assembly. I just knew that I wanted to continue operating in this ecosystem rather than going back to what I used to do in my previous life.
Is there a reason you picked software versus real estate or manufacturing or any other sector?
No, going back to that Forrest Gump theme, it just happened, right? I just happened to meet this founder that just happened to be building a tech company here in Chicago. And I just happened to form a good relationship with him and the founding team. And again, you fast forward a year and a half, they just happened to approach me and say like, hey, why don't you come do this? So it was never part of any sort of well thought out plan. It was never my intention to end up in this ecosystem. I just woke up one day and I'm like, oh, this is what I do, and have done it ever since, for better, for worse.
That's quite amazing. And looking at your growth, you're 150 people building a training organization, which is a hyper competitive space. Walk us through the journey. Like, what was the first sale like from your perspective for your own, services or products? And then how did you sort of go through, first 10 employees, first 50 employees, 100 to where you're today?
Yeah, well, just to clarify, although you do see a lot of people that might be, coded as affiliated with Sales Assembly on LinkedIn, we're actually a small organization. We have less than 10 people, 10 full-time employees, bootstrap company. Those people who you might see on LinkedIn, they're facilitators, different individuals that provide some level of value to Sales Assembly throughout the year, which we could unpack. But yet, the genesis, the story of Sales Assembly, and, credit to my business partner, Jeff, is actually his idea. But a lot of this came out from the fact that when we were both working for the startup that I mentioned before, one of the things that we intentionally did was we started hosting a monthly coffee meeting for the heads of sales, the other heads of sales of what at the time were early stage Chicago tech companies like G2 and Sprout Social and Active Campaign and Spot Hero and all these companies have scaled to significant heights now. But back then, we were all just startups, right? So we would come together every month. We would talk with each other. What are you working on? What are you struggling with? How are you dealing with this? How are you dealing with that? And it didn't take us long to realize that regardless of the products that these companies sold or who they sold it to, all these sales leaders were always complaining about the exact same stuff, right? So, a big part of the genesis was, why don't we start offering solutions to all these things you keep complaining about? So what we did, legitimately was a few ideas on the back of a napkin and went to a handful of the people that were part of that group and essentially said, hey, if we built this, would you pay for it? And enough of them said yes. So we said, great. So we started building things. And then, again, that just continues to snowball. And 8 years later, we're providing, as I mentioned, the skills training for a few hundred companies across the B2B tech ecosystem.
That's amazing. So I'm going to come back to that and double click, but I do want to go back to this sort of, extended ecosystem that you kind of put together with 150 affiliates or associates, how you frame it. 30 years ago, Jack Welch framed this term called borderless organization. And today, especially, as we're at the forefront of the AI wave, how you form relationship and partnerships and how you extend and reach out to customers, how do you go to market is very, very different, right? It's no longer about you go hire 150 people to build something or sell something. It's the network that you put together that itself provides value. So can you talk a little bit about your own journey with your co-founder coming to a point and say, you know what, we're going to put this ecosystem together that we're going to be at the core of it, but we're going to build this hub around that or spokes, around that. Walk us through that journey a little bit.
Yeah, that really resonates because not only do I like to think that if we built a really strong ecosystem across the Sales Assembly member companies today, but, back when we launched Sales Assembly, whereas, when you look at Sales Assembly today, what you see is training and development organization that has a community. as a part of it. When we launched Sales Assembly, it was much more of a community first that did a little bit of training, right? So the actual product, the in air quotes, the product that organizations were paying for back when we first launched was the network, was the community, right? Was monthly coffees, was quarterly breakfasts, so that they would have an avenue. If you were a Chicago-based revenue leader of a B2B technology company, you would have access to this network of peers that you could leverage to exchange ideas, exchange best practices, and just troubleshoot different problems together, right? So the network has always been a part of Sales Assembly. It's in our DNA. It's not only to this day, as I mentioned, part of our product, but it's been a big driver of our growth. Our growth over the past 8 years as a bootstrapped organization, we don't do any outbound. We're not blessed with a whole lot of inbound. Vast majority of our new logos, of which, we're acquiring anywhere between 2 to 4 on a monthly basis right now, pretty consistently, does come from the network. It comes from referrals, introductions, word of mouth, things of that nature. So just the idea of a network, of a community in general, has always been critical to us, not only from a product perspective, but also from a growth perspective as well.
So that's a great segue to sort of the next topic, which is, the companies that you're helping with. Let's focus on that, single dimension. You said, when you're building Sales Assembly, you put the community first or the ecosystem first. A lot of founders, I'm in Silicon Valley. We were just chatting before. There are 100 companies in AI being formed every day. Half of them are here in the Bay Area. And they're very, very tech centric, right? Yet
Yeah.
when you look at the success of whether it's OpenAI or Claude or HiGen or any of these, they designed the product with an ecosystem in mind, right? Not just the user, but also the solution providers and experts and the media and everybody in it. So is there a framework when you're getting involved with a SaaS company, let's say 10 people, trying to build a product? How do you build the go to market as a core feature in the product, not something you think after you build something?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And, from my vantage point, and this might sound like a cop-out answer, it really depends on the product that you're selling, right? And who you're selling it to, and to be clear, what Sales Assembly does, or what we do not do, I should say, is help those companies, go from like 0 to 1, so to speak, as far as building the go-to-market infrastructure, right? I like to think that we could offer value there. But when it comes to, the actual building of that type of ecosystem, or that type of operation might be a better word. Yeah, I mean, it really would depend on the specific buyer persona that you're selling into. But that being said, I'm a big believer in a larger sense that a community is going to be valuable to any SaaS company. Again, regardless of the product that you're selling or who you're selling it to, I think it's important to not only be aware of communities of buyers that exist, but just as, if not more importantly, to get heavily involved with that. Go to where people learn. If you're selling to CIOs, there are going to be groups of CIOs out there. They just naturally sort of are attracted to each other, because people in general, I think, like being surrounded by people like that, right? So you find out where these individuals are collecting, are collating, and start getting involved, start adding value to those types of sub ecosystems. That's going to give you the opportunity, especially in an early stage. If you're a startup trying to make a name for yourself, especially if you're trying to take market share away from some of these big incumbents in the AI space, right? That's where having that type of, relationship might not be the best word, but just finding an opportunity to break through the noise, right? All the noise that is being generated out there. That's going to be the best way to do it, is finding ecosystems that already exist and finding a way to get involved and add value.
So let's step back for a moment. Last night I was preparing for the podcast and I was feeding GPT's a bunch of your posts to get a framework, because you're a prolific writer. You write a lot also. And so kind of the theme I came up with, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that, so you talk a lot about forming relationships, right, with customer. And it's not a
Sure.
transaction. It's a part of a journey. And there's a human side of it. So, but tactically, as a process wise, if I kind of break it down, pre-sales, and sales and post sales. Let's say, I'm a SaaS founder. I build a million, 5 million, $10 million in revenue. And if I simplify two motions, one is like a product led growth and a sales led growth. And I know there are hybrids in between, but let's separate the two. In your portfolio companies that you deal with, in those two buckets, what are similarities and dissimilarities in their go to market motions?
Yeah, that's another really interesting question. I'd say that, one similarity that's going to connect, both those types of go-to-market motions. And again, to your point, sure, there is going to be a hybrid. There are going to be hybrids that exist. But, it's this concept of differentiation, right? If you're a PLG company and you're just, not just relying, but you are relying in a whole lot of different ways on the marketing muscle that you built within the organization, driving that inbound, and of course, leading with the power of your product, allowing prospects to actually get their hands on the product and engaging with it in certain ways before they start writing bigger and bigger checks. And again, trying to tie this back to what you mentioned before, as far as 100 new AI related companies being launched every day, differentiation is going to be key. Right. Whereas in a sales-led growth organization, differentiation is also going to be key, but that's where I think it comes much more down to the differentiation of the individual seller, right? How are they going to build some type of relationship, as you alluded to before, with the prospect, right? And that's where I think, and not to go too deep down this rabbit hole, but we can unpack this if you like, a lot of questions right now as far as what is AI going to automate? What is AI going to replace, especially from a sales standpoint? Things like curiosity, things like trust, these are things that AI cannot adequately replace. So if you're in any type of mid-market or, especially an enterprise level sale, that's where I think that these sort of soft skills, these competencies, like relationship building, like storytelling, like empathy, right? Those are going to become even more and more critical than they are today, because those are going to be the bigger and bigger differentiators when a prospect is looking at you versus any other competing organization.
So from a skill sets wise, if I'm building a PLG motion versus a sales-led motion, is the organization designed differently from a sales perspective in those, or are there similarities or differences?
Yeah, definitely going to be designed differently. I mean, in a PLG motion, you're starting in most cases, if you're a sales professional, you're starting from, you have a little bit more of a head start, I guess, so to speak, would be the best way to frame it. Because presumably, once a sales professional from a PLG organization or a PLG focused organization, once they're engaging with the prospect already has some type of verifiable experience with your product, right? And a big part of what your focus is going to be there is going to be, okay, let me expand the relationship. Let me expand the relationship that already exists, right? Whereas in a sales-led growth organization, a big part of the job is just establishing that relationship in the underworld, right? Going from 0 to 1, where in sales assembly is a perfect example of this. We do not sell software. Our product is training. Right. And, people could try, training, but trying training at scale, right? Across different people on the team, that's tough to, that's tough to execute in more of like a PLG type of motion. So the big part of our sales process is, yes, it is building trust. It is building credibility with VPs of sales and CROs that, we're hoping are going to entrust us with the training and development of their team. Right, the individuals who are responsible for driving revenue, driving expansion, sales, et cetera, et cetera.
So let's take a sort of a revenue point, let's say $10 million, right? And walk us through, in your frame of mind, what does the sales organization look like for a PLG versus a sales-led? And they may be selling into two different segments, two different products. I understand that. So I'll let you simplify that at the same frame. How does the organization look like, and what skills do you think in today's age they need to focus on building?
I think that from a skills perspective, there is going to be consistency, especially if that you use that benchmark of $10 million in revenue. Taken on the PLG side, again, if we're presuming that the day-to-day activities are going to be much more focused on driving expansion, right? I mean, what are the competencies that are going to be needed there and the skills that are going to be needed there? again, things like storytelling, right? Things like multi-threading, effective discovery, right? Going back to a basic one. Now you translate that over to a sales organization that maybe is doing, heavily outbound, right? It's like they're cold calling, they're cold emailing, they're just trying to break into a conversation, from the very beginning. Same skills are going to apply, right? It's just you're leveraging these skills in different ways. Driving expansion, you do need to be a great storyteller. Here's why this product is going to add just as much value to these different business units across your organization as it has to you. Storytelling in the sales led motion, when you're trying to get on the very first call with a prospect, being able, you mentioned that, writing as a skill, an extremely important skill in this day and age if you want to find a way to break through the noise, given all the AI generated email noise that's out there. Being able to craft any compelling story in a written word format, or when you're on a first discovery call with a prospect, right? So the skills are going to be consistently necessary across the board. I think it's more about how you deploy them, right? How they need to be deployed. That's what's going to be different when you compare these two types of organizations.
So let me bring another dimension in now. Let's introduce segment. $10 million companies, we'll do a 2x2 classic consulting way. So you have PLG and sales led, and then you have mid-market and sort of enterprise. Sales cycles are very different. So do the
Yep.
skills now going to be different as we sell in the mid-market versus enterprise in any of those boxes?
That's another really interesting question. I would say that and sorry to sound like a broken record, not going to be different, but they're going to be deployed differently, right? So we talk about, take storytelling again as an example. When you're selling, let's say a lower mid-market or SMB sale, you are crafting a hopefully compelling story to one individual, one decision maker, right? When you're in a complex enterprise level sale, you may be crafting a story to 9, 10, 11, 12, 15 different decision makers. And the nuance there is it can't be the same story to every point of contact, because different points of contact are going to have different motivations, right? The story that you tell to finance cannot and should not be the same story that you're crafting to the sales leader or to the CTO or to the RevOps leader, right? Because they all care about different things, right? So again, the skill competencies is going to be consistently needed, but again, it's going to be how are you going to deploy it? I mean, that's where the big differences are going to come into play when you're breaking organizations down based on those sort of segments.
So I want to come back to this paradigm that we had sort of before COVID, that if you're selling a product less than 7 to 10K, you cannot build a BDR motion internally because it's too expensive from a conversion rate wise, even if you hit industry average. Therefore, you have to be heavily digital and you have to drive mass marketing. And as the dollar goes up, at a certain point, like 30, 50K beyond, you have to go beyond just inside sales. You need field sales, right? Today, in our space, we're closing $500,000 deal all from inside. There's no more, because customers are all spread out. They got used to doing Zoom calls. Procurement is buying, kind of the same way, but through the web, right? Which was unthinkable before COVID. Like if you sold a 50 to 100K product, sales team needed to travel. So talk to us a little bit, is going back to one word you use, multi-threading. Is it easier or harder? Because, when I grew up in this industry, you'd go in, meet the buying team face to face, exchange business cards, looking at their body language, you would figure out who to ping. You could thread offline. Even though it was harder, you could pick up the phone and call, right? But in today's world, sometimes buyers keep their videos off, right?
Yeah.
And they don't put their name in. So you're searching on LinkedIn who they are. You don't even know their identity, but they could be a major decision maker. What happens to multi-threading when you come to this kind of opaque phase where you're trying to sell a 100K deal and you got a multi-thread? How do you reach?
Yeah, that it's funny that you mention that. And yeah, you're exactly right. In the olden days, so to speak, you bring a box of donuts to one consolidated location, you're going to be able to meet everyone who you need to meet, presumably. But yeah, now to answer your question in short, I think this is the power of effective research, right? I mean, all the information is out there if you're willing to do the work and look for it. I mean, of course, AI is making that easier and easier. And of course, there's never going to be unlimited access to every single piece of information that you need, especially if you're selling to private companies as opposed to publicly traded companies. But hopefully, you're going to be in a position where there's going to be a lot that you can infer, right? Just based on other organizations that you sold to that look on paper like the organization that you're trying to sell into now, right? And then so, let's say starting at the high level, it's determining like, okay, who is going to be a stakeholder in this process? Like traditionally across the board, it's going to be these 3, 4, 5, 6 people, these specific job titles. And then from there, like you said, it's doing the manual work of finding them on LinkedIn, doing research on each and every one of them. And, just as importantly, bring this full circle when we talk about the opportunity that we don't have to bring donuts to a consolidated office somewhere and meet everyone, it's getting in touch with them, right? How do you find, because not every champion is going to be effective at introducing me to the 2 or 3 other stakeholders that I might need to meet. So, I'm going to have to find a way to craft a compelling narrative, a compelling story to reach out to them directly to at least get them interested in giving me the time of day.
I did a podcast with Gabe Lulo. He runs Alley-Oop, an SDR firm. He has about a little more than 150 reps. And one of the things that really struck me what he said was that he said that today SDR needs to be an influencer. The whole day of picking up the phone and dialing and getting somebody and convincing them, building that trust that you talk about, is kind of gone because you can dial at such a high volume level using AI. So my question to you have now said a couple of times, you said, skills are the same. They just need to be deployed differently, mid-market versus enterprise,
Yep.
SMB versus, whatnot, PLG versus sales-led. So am I hearing from you that the digital skills and the physical skills, whether it's presence and polish and pitch, like whatever those attributes are they kind of merging that you got to have both? How you play, what tool do you take out is different based on, is that what you're trying to say?
In a sense, and again, not to throw out another cop-out answer, but it depends, right? So for example, if I'm an enterprise level AE, I don't need to have the same skills and competencies as a BDR in my team. Like I don't necessarily need to be great at cold calling because I have a team that's going to do that for me. What I do need to be great at is, and you said executive presence, credibility, being able to build that kind of stuff. Funnily enough, I think that the BDRs, to your point a moment ago, they do need to have those competencies because that's the only way that they're going to be able to stand out from the crowd, right? Stand out in the sea of sameness that you alluded to before. So yes, it is a little bit more of an uphill climb, so to speak, for the junior level folks on the team compared to the senior level folks where, by and large, if you are a successful enterprise AE, chances are you've probably been in this business for at least 7-10 years. You have that kind of muscle memory where you're used to meeting people in person. You remember what that feels like. You remember what it takes to be successful in doing that, building that type of credibility across, a whole multitude of senior level decision makers. Much easier for you to affect that today, right? When you're trying to drive those meetings rather than a new BDR who, might not have that muscle memory. That, it reminds me of a story. We worked with a company. They, about a year ago, they were making a big push to get their sales reps to get back out on the road more. It's like, hey, we got to start meeting people in person. And they were getting a whole lot of resistance, and they presumed that the resistance was work-life balance related, right? Like, hey, the reps don't want to travel, they don't want to be away from home, et cetera, et cetera. They did a whole lot of surveys internally, and what they found out was that there was a legitimate level of anxiety amongst the reps. They did not know how, logistically, they did not know how to take people to lunch. They did not know how to meet multiple people at the same time in an office. Because think about it, if you were a BDR that was hired in 2018 or 2019, and you're promoted to an AE in 2020, all you know is this, right? All you know is 30-minute Zoom calls, right? So they actually had to build, it might sound silly to older folks like you and I, they had to build entire internal training programs around, if I'm trying to sell to Matt and I have an appointment at his office at 10 o'clock and I pull up Uber, I can't show up at 9:55. Like I have to arrive at 9:30 because I have to go through security, I have to check in, I have to account for traffic, like all those things that to you and I sounds like, well, yeah, no duh. I mean, but this is basic stuff. They had no muscle memory, right? They had no frame of reference of how to do that, right? So for a lot of the, the younger generation sales reps, so to speak, we do see that today where there are some pretty big deficiencies on those types of, what you and I might consider basic competencies when you compare it to the slightly more tenured folks that were selling pre-COVID.
I did one podcast with Amelia Taylor, and she talked about like their five generations at work. You have alphas, you have Gen Zs, you have millennials, you have X and the boomers, right? And so as sort of the boomers retire and Gen Z get into this major influencer, even maybe buying position, in TikTok, I don't know, 6 months ago, there's like whole thing going on with Gen Z stare. Like you ask them a question because they're so accustomed to looking at screens and spending time on
Yeah.
themselves. So do you think the buyers are also changing on the other side, that they don't want to be at lunches? They don't want to be, kind of schmoozed around, and they want to get features, functions, understanding on like, where do you see selling is going 5 years down the road?
Yeah, I don't want to make the mistake of trying to make predictions because things are changing so quickly right now. But I will say that that is a definite possibility, right? I mean, there's B2C-ification of B2B going on, right now. And the perfect example is something like Carvana, right? I mean, 5 years ago, it's like, no one's going to buy a car online. And no, you got to show up, you got to drive it. And, sure, in part, Carvana models like that are successful because the buying experience of buying a car is traditionally pretty terrible. But still, that's 15, 20, 30, 50, $70,000 purchase that you're just doing online without ever interacting with anybody, right? So, you combine that with, all things Amazon and just everything all the conveniences we have access to day to day. Yeah, that there is a good chance that those conveniences and those expectations continue to filter into the B2B environment, right? And, we do see companies selling, $50,000 products without ever talking to the prospect. And, prospect like, figuring out, PLG motion to your point, like, great, I'm good at this. So that is definitely a possibility where, the buyers, someone like you and I may say like, hey, let's grab lunch. And they may think, no, why the hell would we grab lunch? Yeah, I don't want to do that.
So is digital, do you think, if I were betting on one set of skills, if I'm hiring forward, should I be betting on people that have more digital skills? And I want to bring another dimension, not just digital skills, but writing skills. Do you think you have an unfair advantage over an engineer like me because you had liberal arts communication strength? Because I always struggled communicating. First of all, English is not my native language. Second of all, I'd rather finish a sentence like in 4 words than expand. So I've
Yes.
learned how to talk to guests like you over the years. But do you think liberal arts people have an advantage in the tech space that they didn't have before because things are going digital and you got to communicate better to different personas?
I I might be biased, but I would think so. I think that when you look all throughout history, the history of sales at least, and you look at these different periods, 1900 to 1920, 1920 to 1940, et cetera, et cetera. The common theme as far as like, okay, what works for sales during that, specific period of time is whatever's different, right? 2019, 2020, what worked? Hitting people up with these, sequences through outreach or sales, all because that was different, right? The predictable revenue method. Like, okay, well, that's different. And it worked. What we see working now over the past, year or 2 years as everything has been digital, to your point, is meeting people in person, right? We see that working a lot now just because, again, it's different. For the same reason why we're seeing a big cold calling resurgence over the past year, because it's different, because we're all getting spammed through emails. Like, oh, at least someone's calling me. I'm able to talk to someone. So when you combine all those real world data points and you add my biases on top of them, I do like to think that as AI and efficiency and automation becomes much more prevalent, what is going to be different in the future? Yeah, a history major, a philosophy major, right? Someone that they can't write code that save their lives, but you could put them in a position where they could have a conversation like this, I'm hopeful, not only hopeful, but I'm confident that those are going to be the big differentiators over the next few years.
So coming back, we spend a lot of time on people and skills and, different sets that are required based on different segments. Let's talk a little bit about process from a sales process wise. And you talk a lot about the journey. It's not a transaction up front. It's how you take care of, post sales, and then how you grow the account. How do you communicate to them? Walk us through a little bit from an organizational perspective. I may have a certain skill sets up front to do a transaction, but I need other skill sets to grow the relationship, especially in SaaS, right? If we're a multi-product company. So when we think about sales, traditionally we think about pre-sales, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of the value in, you talk about first year you have 95% retention. In the third year you get 60% retention, right? Your organizational value drops substantially. Walk us through, what does sales look like post starting the relationship?
Yeah, well, two things there. Yes, that there are a whole other, to your point, set of skills and competencies, things like project management is a big one. Conflict resolution is going to be another big one that, that these folks that are going to be effective on the post-sale side are going to have. But at the same time, coincidentally, and, to the point that you mentioned a moment ago, as far as the year 1 versus year 3 retention, I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing a big push and have been in the ecosystem over the past 18 months, ever since Silicon Valley Bank collapsed and the tech recession took place back then. It seemed like everyone agreed upon at once, like, oh crap, our CSMs, our post-sales teams need to become more commercialized, right? We have all this potential revenue that's sitting within our existing install base that we're not capitalizing. So yes, although there are a whole lot of different skill sets and competencies, again, like project management that I mentioned before, that are imperative for a post-sales professional to have, what are we seeing across a few other companies that we work with? Organizations that are saying, our CSMs, our account managers, we need to get them training on negotiation, right? We need to get them training on storytelling. We need to get them training on more effective discovery, right? So they have to start looking more like the pre-sales professionals, right? Which has admittedly in many organizations created this friction, because when you look at the traditional CSM profile, especially for some of these earlier stage companies, who are they by and large? They're industry domain experts, right? Like, no, I'm not a salesperson. Like, if we sell an ed tech software, I'm a former teacher, right? I could talk education with a client all day long, but no, I don't sell anything. So we're seeing a lot of organizations struggling right now to sort of thread the needle between like, okay, well, we need you to start actually like driving revenue, but we want to make sure that we're doing so in a way that doesn't take you outside of your comfort zone. We don't want you to feel as though you're turning into one of those, sleazy sales professionals like the AE that brought in the logo in the first place.
So let's come back to kind of AI, because what's happening at the application level, this whole notion that's starting bring your own AI, because adoption is happening at the edges at the user level, right? $20 a month of this tool and that tool, whether the company pays for it or not, people are just doing it, whether it's fear or need, whatever that is, they're adopting. So if I'm going to try to bring in these 2 points that we discussed earlier, PLG and sales led. So in this AI sort of revolution that's kind of happening where users are adopting, but organizations need to be sold. So do you see in your portfolio company, did you lead with PLG upfront, a lot less sales investment as per se, maybe digital marketing or digital conversion you're focused on product wise, but your customer success team has deep problem solving skills and selling skills. Selling is actually happening after.
Yeah, we are seeing that a lot, especially for the startups, right? Companies that are formed or that have been formed over the past 3 to 4 years. That tends to be the motion that they start with, and for various obvious reasons. To your point, it's more cost effective up front. You don't need to hire a big sales team. All you need is some halfway competent post sales professionals to work on implementation and expansion, right? And then from there, it's like, okay, well, how quickly can we pivot our motion to start selling directly into the enterprise, which we are seeing, these companies that started with that PLG motion maybe 2, 3, 4 years ago seem to be moving quicker into that area. After they get a little bit of traction, they've determined like, okay, we have some product market fit. Now we got to start selling upstream. We're seeing that happen quicker as well.
And from a process wise, is the process roughly the same how customer success team sold before, or today you think that requires a different approach for install base, upselling, cross selling?
Yeah, I don't think it necessarily requires a different approach compared to what worked before. I think the difference today is who's been tasked with doing it, right? In a lot of organizations that have reached some level of scale, that they will have dedicated growth teams, right? Where it's like, yeah, we're not new logos, we're not just retention. Your whole job is expansion. What we're seeing more and more is that CSMs who traditionally like, no, I'm just handling the renewal and customer support. They're being charged with driving much more expansion revenue much earlier on, for a number of reasons. Number one, it's economical. Number two, the opportunity exists to drive more revenue. So, hey, why not take it? And number three, it's making sure that they have a competitive moat. Right. It's like, we need to get more and more hooks into these clients that we've had for a year, 2 years, so that all these upstart competitors, like you said before, 100 new AI companies being formed every day or every week, whatever it is, that they don't have the opportunity to start nipping at our heels.
So let's come back to sort of the last point. We talked about people, we talked a little bit about the process. Let's talk about the stack, the tech stack in selling, right? And I saw a stat from one of the VCs that 12 years ago, roughly average spend for a salesperson was $700 on tech stack, buying a CRM or something, right? Today, average spend on a salesperson is $8,500 per year, various tools, right? And there are consolidation happening. But in one area that solutions are exploding are in the sales space, driven by AI, because a lot of it is conversational intelligence centric, right? So as you are building skills at an organizational level, tech skills, part of a person's skills is very important, right? They have to have the soft skills, but they also need to know how to use a specific piece of software, right? How do you see that's happening today? Is there a lot of confusion, or are there things kind of settling? Where is it today?
Yeah, how it's happening today is messily. And that's a byproduct, I think, of companies investing in too many solutions within too short of a time frame. And especially all these AI point solutions that are relatively inexpensive, easy to implement. 2-3 reps on the team could start using something, and then 2-3 other reps on the same team could start using something else that maybe solving similar challenges like account research, outreach, whatever the case may be. Yeah, so the mistake that we see a lot of organizations making on this, which is leading to a lot of unnecessary spend and unnecessary frustration, and it's due in large part to the lack of friction that exists between buying a whole lot of these really inexpensive point solutions, is it's letting their team go wild, right? And, one of the things that I think it's imperative for leaders to think about is like, okay, if we're gonna build some type of AI component into our business, even though it is theoretically possible and financially possible to just roll this out broadly, we have to keep a couple things in mind. Number one, a lot of these solutions are new, right? Are they going to pivot 3 months from now? Are they going to get bought out 6 months from now? Are they going to go out of business 9 months from now? What are you going to do with your workflow, right, when one of those things happens? But number two, I'm a big believer in the idea of starting small, right? And not leaders think about like, okay, well, I need to solve my top of funnel issues. I'm going to find an AI solution to do that. That's too broad, right? That's too big. Rather than saying I need AI to solve my top of funnel problems, say like, no, get as micro as possible. I need AI to solve my reps' account research problems so that they could craft more thoughtful outreach. Like that's something like, okay, well, I could find a solution that could just do that. I could start a small working group of 5 to 7 reps. They could have access to it. I could track what's working, what's not working. And after some A/B testing and some thoughtful analysis, then I could start expanding that to 10 reps, to 20 reps, right? Replicating success across the organization. Then once you do that, okay, find one other small component of this broader theme of top of funnel and start solving for that. Right. So it's less about solving these big, hairy, these big ticket items and solving just one piece of this overall larger process.
So, from an organizational design, evolution, skills development perspective, right? When you think about maybe 15 years ago, there was no such thing as sales ops. We had sales desks that dealt with price lists and special pricing and whatnot. Maybe a little bit of onboarding. Then sort of sales ops came around, driven by kind of CRM. Enablement became a big focus, but tactical around the product and the solutions. And pricing approval got automated. Then RevOps came around because all these other tools are now getting intent, right? Now there is a big buzz about buyer's intent because you got to multi-thread. You got to figure out who else is looking at it. You got to push content, right? So when you think about 100 hours of training, I don't know what's the right number, but let's say 100 hours of training. How much of that is soft skill centric? How much of it is digital centric? And how much of it functional? Use this software this way, click this button to see. Like when you think about that content, how has that evolved and where is it now?
Yeah, that's from our perspective. And of course, we sell training for a living. I tell our clients, like, when it comes to the skills training that we provide on things like, discovery, storytelling, et cetera, we've spoken about before, 1 to maybe 3 hours per month, right? That's, anything more than you start to be over indexing too much on the skills and not, to your point, providing enough opportunity to train on the process and the product, right? And it's tough because you have to balance all these different components of training with actually doing the job, right? And for a sales professional, I mean, time off the floor is money. So how do you walk this fine line between, okay, we need to make sure that they know how to use all the tooling effectively so that they're as efficient as possible. But at the same time, we got to make sure that when they get on a call with a prospect, they could actually explain our product, right, in the detail and the granularity that we expect. But at the same time, we also need to make sure that they're asking compelling discovery questions so they have the opportunity to move the deal forward, right? It is sort of a shifting balance depending on the organization. But I'd say, yeah, no more than 1 to 3 hours a month of skills-based training. Everything else does need to be focused on the product, the process, anything else that is, just company specific.
So let's come back to a dollar number because that'll define percent and how on the priority level in a CRO's mind. If I take the $10 million revenue for a SaaS company, right? Let's say growing 20-25%. So NDR plus new logo sales, let's say $2.5 million a year, right? So I look at the sales organization, let's say, I don't know, 700K a rep between CS and et cetera. Maybe they have 5 to 10 reps, right? Altogether. So what percent of my sales dollar budget I should allocate into training? Because when I look back to the paradigm that you and I came from, sales training happened when a sales VP joined. He or she brought in
Yep.
whether Miller Hyman or spin selling or bow ties, whatever they were used to, they brought that in, right? Or challenger sales, and then it kind of fizzled away. Today, with the rate of change that's happening, it is a function that you need to have, whether you outsource to someone like your team or insource. What percent of my sales budget do you think I should allocate in that $10 million revenue to make sure I keep my team fresh, upbeat and closing, most importantly?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, going off of round numbers, and I tend to go too deep down these rabbit holes. But I'm thinking like, okay, $10 million organization, relatively small, got a handful of reps, probably not nearly as much processed as there might be, in let's say a $50 million organization, right? Keeping it, around $500,000 or below, right? What that is going to allow you to do when I think about this just super tactically, that's going to allow you to bring in something like Medic or MedPick, right? Build it, a sales process, which I do think is necessary, even though it's just realistically stages in a CRM. And at the end of the day, it gives everyone sort of baseline, right? And then from there, you have, an enablement manager, right? That is providing the product training, product updates, features, functionality, et cetera, allocating for his or her headcount. Then on top of that, yeah, skills-based training, whether that is, again, through sales assembly or through another enablement practitioner on the team whose sole purpose is to do that kind of stuff.
So what I'm hearing is roughly 5%, maybe 3 to 5% range. You actually have to invest into your sales team on an ongoing basis to keep their skills upgraded. Does that also include the rep stack, the tech stack?
That's an interesting question. I'd say, yeah, if you want to include the reps tech stack, And to your point a few moments ago, it's getting sort of out of control these days. It might flex a little bit higher, but yeah, just doing the back of the napkin math in my head, I would say not much higher than that.
Okay. So I want to kind of go forward and kind of wrap up our conversation. So if you think forward next 12 to 18 months horizon, if I'm a CRO, I make that financial commitment to keep the skills updated and the team fresh. What are the 2 or 3 areas tech investment wise you're seeing in the selling space that are interesting?
Yep. One of them, so we talked, you mentioned conversation intelligence, which has been a really big one, for the past decade or so. Going a step further, it's like, okay, what do we do with all the intelligence that we gather through the conversations? I see really interesting things being done as far as building compelling business cases, right? When we talk about storytelling, how are we going to be able to craft a narrative on paper that I could send you, my champion, and you could send that same document to 3, 5, 7 different stakeholders and have each of them look at it like, oh, yeah, well, this makes sense. And I see, the reason behind this. So, we think that is not only exciting, but also it's important. Another one, and I spoke to this a few moments ago, is all things research, right? The more research that you do pre-call, the more research that you are able to build into those business cases, when it gets to that point in the sales process, the more research that you're able to come equipped with on an initial call so that you could actually show up with a point of view to share with the prospect, which I think is critical as far as differentiation right now. Those are going to be really the 2 areas, translating the intelligence into something tangible as far as a shareable document and all the research that goes into different stages of the sales process.
Amazing. Man, I have so many more questions. We have to have you back. I'm going to have Peter reach out and schedule a follow-up session because we want to go into this whole post-sale cycle that you talk a lot about we didn't get to. But thank you for your time. It's been amazing. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was great.